Welcome back to Roughing It.
To understand America, you've got to understand the key people who created it, which is why we went to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. Maintained for over 160 years by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the place is frozen in time, 1799, the year Washington died. A tremendous amount of work has gone into the restoration and preservation of this emblem of American history and is well worth the visit. The place is an ongoing historical and archaeological study. The estate thrives with historically accurate working grounds featuring native livestock of the time, gardens with what grew when Washington was alive, a working blacksmith, grain mill, and distillery. Skylar met some of the residents. While she quickly found she would never have the vocation of sheepdog, as usual, she did make some friends. Inside the 21-room mansion, largely designed by Washington himself, the rooms are set to match with what the home would have looked like in the late 1700s. At the slave quarters, you learn that in later life, Washington realized the injustice of slavery. In his will, he stipulated the slaves be set free at the time of his wife Martha's death. She freed them before she died. During America's War of Independence, Martha accompanied her husband to his winter encampments. He found her presence so essential to the war effort and morale of his soldiers that he asked Congress to add her to the payroll. Washington was not only a military general and the first president of the United States, he was also an avid horseman, surveyor, inventor, farmer, and businessman. George Washington is credited with inventing a drill plow and a 16-sided barn used for more efficient threshing of wheat. With no shortage of business acumen, the Washingtons also turned a profit from their wharf and fishery. Inside the museum, see the forensically recreated George Washington in various phases of his life. Plagued with dental problems, his famous dentures made of a combination of ivory, human, and animal teeth are on display. At the final resting place of the Washington family, I reflected that perhaps the greatest thing about Washington was not what he did, but what he didn't do. With a wide open and even encouraged opportunity, he did not seize power with his victory of the Revolutionary War and become king or emperor of America. Instead, he gave up personal power so democracy could prevail. We, the people. To learn more about the Washingtons and the estate, go to mountvernon.org. As if all his other accomplishments weren't enough, George Washington was also a Freemason.
George Washington Masonic Temple.
Pass by the famous Pentagon, and you find yourself at Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington was originally the home of Robert E. Lee, commander of the Southern forces during the Civil War. During the war, the government confiscated the property due to unpaid taxes and turned it into a community for recently freed slaves and a cemetery for dead soldiers. While Lee, along with all the Confederate generals and politicians who fought to keep slavery legal in America, were pardoned after the war, his home was turned into the final resting place for many of the fallen soldiers at the end of his rifles. The U.S. government later returned and then purchased the estate from Lee's descendants. JFK's Eternal Light sits below Lee's home. The Tomb of the Unknowns has been continuously guarded by the U.S. Army since July 2, 1937. The Department of Veterans Affairs currently offers 57 authorized faith emblems for placement on markers to represent the deceased's faith, which also speaks to the diversity of the nation. The cemetery is huge. It spans 624 acres, or the size of 472 football fields. The number of people buried there is roughly the same size as the population of Minneapolis, over 400,000. The amount of graves is truly astonishing and also moving. The iconic Marine Corps Memorial and the rows and rows of graves serve as a reminder of all the people who gave their lives to this country that we had been traveling across. We had made it to the nation's capital, the center of government of what we had come to know as a vast land with as much varying terrain as culture. A striking thing about D.C. is the widespread Roman architecture, a physical homage to the founding beliefs in a republic. And like the Romans, America has absorbed and been influenced by the cultures it has fostered. It formed a new identity out of this, and with that identity, synergistically reached out with its own influence on the world. Indeed, D.C. is truly an international place with more than 175 embassies. The city is a mecca of art and culture, not just politics and government. Tip number 1. Most museums are free. The Smithsonian feels almost endless, with 19 buildings, including a museum dedicated to bonsai trees. The National Portrait Gallery houses the portrait of every president. Abraham Lincoln's death mask and hand molds are on display, along with the last photograph taken of him. Inside the National Archives, the original Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and Bill of Rights are on display. Photography and filming are prohibited, as are dogs. Tip number 2, doggy daycare. Should it become too difficult to accommodate the presence of a dog, check out services such as rover.com, PetSmart Doggy Daycare, or any pet-sitting local businesses with which you feel comfortable. Otherwise, DC is an open playing field, and we came to play. All roads in the city lead to the Capitol building, and you'll find the lettered streets don't include a J Street because the letter J didn't exist in the Latin alphabet. There are miles of subterranean tunnels for senators and members of the House, and there are marble bathtubs installed in the 1850s to keep the representatives from stinking. Skylar would be happy to know the White House loves dogs. There isn't a president in history who hasn't had a dog except for Donald Trump. The first dogs, Juno and Satan, belonged to the first resident, John Adams. Many animals have made their home at the White House, including a flock of sheep that mowed the lawn and donated their wool to the Red Cross. We took a rest and cooled down in the National Garden before losing our way back to the car. Arriving 30 seconds too late, we found the car had been ticketed. Fortunately, I had at least arrived in time to save it from being towed. As I walked along the Supreme Court building and in amongst the Justice monuments, I decided to fight the ticket. In the end, I won. Fines canceled, and there was much rejoicing. At the National Mall, you won't find a Macy's. Instead, you'll find the most visited national park of iconic monuments and memorials in the country. The National Mall is a work in progress, with the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial opening in 2011. At one end, you'll notice the Washington Monument has two tones because halfway through construction, funding ran out and the Civil War happened. Reconstructing the South consumed time and money, and the monument wasn't finished until 20 years later. By that time, the marble quarry where the base stones came from had closed. The Army Corps of Engineers did their best to match it and finish the structure. Across from the reflecting pool sits a memorial of possibly the greatest president of all, Abraham Lincoln. Again, we see a nod to Rome with the Roman-adapted Greek architecture and Lincoln's arms resting on Roman symbols of power. Ultimately, his greatest power lay in his words, which adorn the walls here. The Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural speech carved into the wall carry a weighty presence. Recall Robert E. Lee and company's pardon? At the end of the Civil War, Lincoln felt that enough blood, all from Americans, had been shed. He wanted to rebuild the South and bring them back into the Union through post-war peace. Perhaps the greatest facet to Lincoln, other than his intelligence, was his ability to empathize. Inspired by Lincoln, Skylar was all too eager to pour her empathy out on the first stranger she could find. No one wanted to talk to me, they just wanted to talk to Skylar. At the Vietnam Memorial, there are more than 58,000 names. The Vietnam Women's Memorial commemorates the 265,000 women who served in the Vietnam War, many of whom worked as nurses. The World War II Memorial honors the armed forces and civilians of every state who sacrificed their lives for the war effort. In the evening, the fireflies are ghostly, igniting and dancing, almost like the souls of everyone lost, the souls that are commemorated here. We walked, heavy-hearted, contemplating the people who gave their lives, the reasons they gave them. What is it to be an American? Why is the answer different for every person? Why were there so many dead to preserve this notion? And where the hell were we? What do you do if it's a dark and stormy night and thunder is crashing all around you? You have fun! Good thing I packed an umbrella, which I left in the car miles away. And since we were having fun, might as well continue the tour of D.C. I might get electrocuted. I actually just stopped and asked a Secret Service man, how do I get to the White House? Turns out, D.C. has more rainfall per year than Seattle. The impressive rainfall has done more than just catch tourists unaware. For several decades, starting in the 1880s, the U.S. Fish Commission had several fisheries around the Washington Monument where they mass-produced carp imported from Germany and goldfish. For a time, anyone used to be able to write to their congressman and ask for a free goldfish. Carp leaked into the Potomac River during floods and became a massive problem as they devoured the native fish and threw the ecosystem out of sync. Decades of work commenced to fix the problem, but many species were lost along the way. Washington, D.C. is full of winos, with residents consuming more wine per capita than any other state. That's probably where they are right now, sensibly inside, drinking wine. She's having so much fun. And since we were out anyway, might as well check out the nightlife. At the hotel, she guided me back to our room. Grateful to have seen what we saw and to be clean and dry, we rested up before departing for our next stop.
You happy? You happy we're in a hotel? I am so sorry to disappoint you, but this is the last hotel for a while.
Find out where we go in next episode.